The wedding had been in the works for months, and the entire town of Dawson was buzzing with excitement. The church, typically a quiet and serene place, was overflowing with anticipation as Sarah Dawson, the daughter of the revered rancher Jack Dawson, was about to marry Lucas Hawthorne, a young man admired for his success and charm. Jack stood at the front of the church, his expression proud but mixed with a hint of nervousness. As his daughter approached the altar, her gown shimmering under the light, Jack could feel the weight of the moment, knowing this was a significant day in both their lives. Yet something in the air seemed different. It was as if a storm was quietly brewing. Sarah, beautiful as ever in her bridal gown, couldn't shake the feeling of dread gnawing at her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held onto the bouquet, her gaze shifting nervously toward Lucas, who stood with a warm smile waiting for her. But every time her eyes moved from him, she found herself glancing toward the back of the church, as if drawn by an invisible force. There, standing at the door, was a woman she didn't recognize, a stranger whose presence felt wrong in the sacred space. The woman's clothes were simple but unkempt, and in her arms she cradled a child, her eyes filled with a strange certainty. As the ceremony began, the air grew thicker. The vows were spoken, the priest's words echoing in the room, but Sarah couldn't focus. Her eyes kept drifting back to the woman, her heart pounding with an unsettling premonition. She forced herself to concentrate on Lucas, who was smiling at her with affection. But just as the final vows were about to be exchanged, the woman began to move. There was a collective gasp as the crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. She walked slowly down the aisle, the baby swaddled in her arms, a quiet authority in her every step. The unsettling feeling that had been brewing in the room turned into a palpable tension, as if the earth itself had shifted. The woman reached the altar where Jack and Sarah stood, frozen in shock. Without hesitation, she stopped before them, and in a voice so calm it was chilling, she said, "This baby is your son's." The words hung in the air, thick with gravity, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The guests, who had been so eager for this joyous occasion, stood motionless, unable to comprehend what had just been revealed. Jack's hand shook, and he dropped the glass of whiskey he had been holding. It shattered on the floor, but no one noticed the noise. All eyes were fixed on the woman and the baby in her arms. Sarah's face drained of color as her gaze locked on the baby, the words echoing in her mind. The world seemed to spin, her heart racing, the ground beneath her feet suddenly uncertain. Lucas, once calm and composed, looked like a man struck by a thunderbolt. His face turned ashen, his mouth moving, but no words coming out. The room, once filled with excitement and joy, was now a space of confusion and disbelief. Questions ran rampant through everyone's minds, but no one dared to speak, as if waiting for someone to make sense of the chaos. The woman's presence was like a storm that had suddenly uprooted everything in its path. Jack, who had always been a rock, stood utterly still, his mind racing as he tried to understand the impossible statement that had just been made. His eyes flickered from the woman to the baby and then to Sarah, whose expression was one of utter shock. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a clock ticking. No one knew what to do, and the wedding, which had seemed destined to be a beautiful union, now felt like it was on the edge of collapse. The question hanging in the air was impossible to ignore. Who was this woman? And what did she mean by claiming that this child was Jack's son? The truth, whatever it was, had been hidden for too long, and now it had come to light in the most public and unforgiving way possible. The once celebratory atmosphere of the wedding was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. As the room waited for someone to speak, the weight of the mystery grew heavier with every passing second. Jack's knees began to tremble as he tried to process the impossible reality unfolding before him, and Sarah, lost in confusion and fear, stood unable to move. This wasn't just a revelation, it was a bombshell. The wedding, which was supposed to be the happiest day of Sarah's life, was spiraling into something entirely different. It was no longer about the vows they had just made, but about the secrets that had been buried for far too long. The truth had come crashing down, and the lives of those involved were about to change forever. As the guests exchanged nervous glances and waited for someone to take control of the situation, it was clear the wedding had ended, not with a kiss, but with a devastating truth that no one could have ever expected. The room was in utter chaos as Margaret's words hung heavy in the air. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into frantic conversations, but no one dared approach her. Her expression remained calm, almost detached, as if she were delivering a simple fact rather than the bombshell that had just been dropped. She stepped forward and gently placed the baby in Jack Dawson's arms, her hands steady as she did so. Jack, still in shock, stared down at the infant, his expression unreadable. Margaret's voice cut through the noise, soft yet powerful. "This is your son, the child you never knew existed." The words seemed to reverberate throughout the room, creating a ripple effect that unsettled everyone present. Sarah's face turned white, and she instinctively took a step back. Her breath caught in her throat as the shock of the revelation began to sink in. Her father, whom she had always admired for his strength, was frozen, his hands shaking as he cradled the baby in his arms. Time seemed to stretch, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the information that had been just thrust upon her. She could hardly look at the child, her thoughts too clouded by disbelief. Her father, a man she had always trusted, was holding a child, his child, that she had never known about. The wedding, which was meant to celebrate love and unity, had been destroyed in an instant. Margaret, sensing the confusion, didn't wait for anyone to ask for clarification. She spoke with a quiet confidence that carried the weight of years of suppressed emotions. She revealed that many years ago, when she and Jack were both young, they had shared a brief affair, one that was passionate yet secretive. It was a time when both of them were caught up in the excitement of youth, unaware of the consequences their actions would eventually have. But one thing led to another, and the affair resulted in a child. Margaret, fearing the scandal that would destroy Jack's reputation and her own, decided to keep the child hidden, raising him in the shadows, away from prying eyes. Jack's face contorted with disbelief as the full gravity of Margaret's words hit him. He stared down at the baby, who had begun to squirm in his arms, and then back up at Margaret. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but no answers came. He felt as though the world had just tilted on its axis, his foundation cracking beneath him. This wasn't just an affair from his past. It was a hidden life, a child who had grown up without his knowledge. It was a betrayal, not just of him, but of everything he had worked for, built, and believed in. The truth that had been buried for so long was now thrust into the open, and there was no escaping it. As if the revelation of Jack's hidden past wasn't enough, Margaret's words continued to unravel the fabric of Sarah's world. She spoke of how the child, now an infant, had been kept hidden from everyone, even from Sarah herself. It was a truth that no one had been prepared for, least of all Sarah. Her father's past was one thing, but the revelation that Lucas, the man she was about to marry, was not her biological father, shattered her in ways she couldn't begin to explain. It was a blow to her identity, to the very foundation of who she thought she was. Sarah looked at Jack, seeking some kind of explanation, but he could only offer a helpless look, as if he too was struggling to come to terms with the truth. Lucas, who had been silent until now, finally exploded in anger. His eyes were wild, his fists clenched as he turned to both Jack and Sarah. "How could you keep this from me?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "How could you let me marry into a lie? I deserve to know the truth. I have the right to know what I'm walking into." His words were sharp, filled with years of resentment that had been building under the surface, never fully voiced until this moment. His anger wasn't just directed at Jack or Sarah, it was aimed at the very foundation of the life he thought he was building with Sarah. Sarah, still reeling, could only look at Lucas in confusion. She had expected him to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but instead, he was turning the anger back on her. She felt a deep hurt spread through her chest, the man she was about to marry now seeming like a stranger. Her mind was too clouded to process his fury, and in that moment, she could only feel the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. She hadn't even known the truth about her own family, and now she had to contend with the fact that the man she was supposed to marry was just as deceived as she had been. The room had become a battleground of emotions, with the wedding that was supposed to unite two families now threatening to tear them apart. Guests were nervously glancing at one another, unsure of how to react or what to say. The joy that had once filled the air had dissipated, replaced by a tense, suffocating atmosphere. Jack, still holding the child in his arms, could hardly meet anyone's gaze. His life had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes, and he didn't know how to fix it. Margaret's revelation had sent ripples of confusion and betrayal through every person in that room, and no one seemed to know how to move forward. With the truth laid bare, the wedding that had promised to be the happiest day of Sarah's life now felt like a distant dream. Her father, her future husband, everyone she had relied on for stability, was now a source of confusion and hurt. Sarah stood there, torn between her father's betrayal and the man who was supposed to be her partner. The weight of the revelations was too much to bear, and she felt herself slipping further and further away from the life she had imagined. The night that was supposed to mark the beginning of her new life now felt like the end of everything she had ever known. As Jack Dawson stood there, holding the baby in his arms, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The shock of the revelation had yet to settle in, and the pride that had once been his foundation seemed to crumble before him. He had always been a man who valued control, who stood firm in the face of any challenge. But now he was reduced to a shell of himself, kneeling before a child he had never known, a child that had been kept from him for years. His pride, his sense of self, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had been a father without even knowing it, and now he had to face the reality of a life he never expected. The weight of his past mistakes crushed him, and he couldn't seem to find a way to bear it. Sarah, standing beside him, watched in horror as her father grappled with the truth. The betrayal she felt was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had always seen her father as a man of honor, a man who had shaped her life with unwavering guidance. But now, the truth had shattered that image, and she felt lost in the wreckage. Her whole world was falling apart, piece by piece. Her identity, built on the love and trust she had always had for Jack, was crumbling. The lie that had been kept from her was more than just a betrayal. It was an erosion of everything she thought she knew. Her father's past had tainted the future she had dreamed of, and the weight of it was more than she could bear. As Sarah's emotions spiraled out of control, the room fell into a heavy silence. The guests, who had been mere witnesses to the spectacle, now became part of the tragedy unfolding before them. Whispers began to circulate through the crowd, each person processing the revelation in their own way. Some were sympathetic towards Sarah, understanding the pain she must be feeling. Others, however, couldn't hide their judgment. How could a family hide such a massive secret for so long? How could they build a life on lies? The tension in the room thickened as the guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to console Sarah or turn away from the truth that was so uncomfortably present. Lucas, who had been standing to the side, watching the scene unfold, could no longer contain his anger. His face was flushed with fury, and his fists clenched at his sides as he stormed toward Margaret. "You've ruined my life," he spat, his voice thick with resentment. "You've taken everything I thought I knew, and you've destroyed it." His words were laced with bitterness as he glared at Margaret, demanding answers. But Margaret, calm and unfazed, merely met his gaze with an icy stare. "Your life wasn't ruined," she replied coolly. "It was built on a lie, just like hers." She pointed towards Sarah, her words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. The gravity of the truth hung heavy in the room, and the tension between them all grew unbearable. Jack, still kneeling with the baby in his arms, felt as though the walls of his life were closing in on him. Margaret's words rang in his ears, and he couldn't deny their truth. He had always prided himself on his integrity, his ability to do right by his family. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of his past, he felt as though he had failed them all. His sense of pride, of being a man of principle, had crumbled in the face of this revelation. He had been living a lie, and the consequences of his actions were more than he could handle. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, and he couldn't find the strength to look either Sarah or Lucas in the eye. The guilt gnawed at him, and he knew that the damage was far deeper than he could have ever imagined. The room, once filled with anticipation and joy, had become a battleground of emotions. The family that had once been bound together by love and trust was now on the brink of collapse. Sarah's heart ached with the realization that the man she had trusted most in the world was the one who had kept this secret from her. Her sense of self was shattered, and the life she had once imagined for herself felt like a distant dream. Her relationship with Lucas, the man she was about to marry, now seemed uncertain and fragile. Lucas, too, was consumed by anger, his sense of betrayal driving him to lash out at everyone around him. His feelings of anger and confusion burned hot, and the pain of being deceived by those closest to him was too much to process. As the emotions in the room boiled over, the fracture within the family deepened. What had started as a single secret, kept hidden for years, had now become a chasm that threatened to tear everything apart. Sarah and Lucas, once a couple bound by love, now found themselves caught in a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. The love they had shared was tainted by the lies that had been hidden from them, and neither knew how to rebuild what had been broken. Jack, a man who had prided himself on his strength, now found himself broken in ways he had never imagined. The weight of his guilt and the realization of his mistakes left him reeling. The family was splintering, and there seemed to be no way to put the pieces back together. The aftermath of the revelation left everyone in the room on edge, unsure of what the future would hold. Jack's guilt and shame, Sarah's heartbreak, and Lucas's fury had created a toxic environment that seemed impossible to escape. The foundation of the Dawson family, built on years of tradition and trust, was now in ruins. No one knew where to go from here, or if they could ever find a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. What had once been a family united by love was now a fractured, broken entity. The future seemed uncertain, and the pain of the past was too great to ignore. The emotional fallout from the secret that had been kept for so long was more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. The tension in the ranch house was unbearable as the family gathered in the living room. The space, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt cold and distant. Jack, Sarah, Lucas, and Margaret sat opposite each other, the weight of the truth hanging between them. Jack, the proud and steadfast patriarch, was slumped in his chair, a man who had always controlled every situation, now utterly defeated by the gravity of his actions. Sarah's eyes, once filled with love and admiration for the father she had always known, now burned with hurt and betrayal. Lucas, too, sat uncomfortably, his anger simmering just below the surface. Margaret, though calm, seemed to carry the heaviest burden, knowing that the truth she had hidden for so long could never be undone. Sarah could barely look at Jack, her heart breaking with every glance. The man who had raised her, who had been her hero, was now the source of her deepest pain. She had trusted him more than anyone in the world, yet he had kept a secret so devastating, so massive, that it threatened to tear apart everything she knew. Her voice shook as she confronted him, demanding to know why he had never told her the truth. "How could you keep this from me, Dad?" Her words were filled with raw emotion, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. Jack, unable to meet her gaze, could only lower his head in shame. He had no answer that could undo the damage he had done, no explanation that could heal the wound he had created. Margaret, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke, her voice low but steady. She explained that she had kept the child hidden not out of malice, but out of fear. "I didn't want to ruin your life, Jack," she said softly. "I didn't want to ruin Sarah's life. I thought if I kept him hidden, it would be easier for everyone." She paused, her eyes flickering to the baby in Jack's arms, who was now peacefully sleeping despite the turmoil around him. "But keeping him a secret all these years, it was wrong, and I'm sorry." Margaret's words were heavy with regret, but there was also an undeniable sense of finality. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The child, once hidden in the shadows, was now a living testament to a past that could never be erased. As Sarah absorbed Margaret's words, the pain only deepened. She turned to Lucas, seeking some kind of solace in the one person who was supposed to be her partner. But Lucas, though his pain was evident, was not broken. His anger flared as he looked at Sarah, demanding answers. "How can we move forward, Sarah? How can I rebuild trust in a relationship that was based on lies?" His words cut through the air, and Sarah could feel the weight of his anger, but it only seemed to push them further apart. Lucas was determined to try and fix what had been broken, but Sarah, still reeling from the betrayal, didn't know if she could continue with the marriage. The bond they had shared felt fragile now, as though it was built on a foundation of deceit that could collapse at any moment. In the midst of the emotional storm, Jack finally spoke, his voice strained with guilt. "I never knew about the baby, Sarah," he said, his eyes brimming with sorrow. "I didn't know until today. Margaret never told me." His words were tinged with regret, and his confession weighed heavily on him. Jack admitted that he regretted not being there for Margaret and the child, but he insisted that the truth was kept from him as well. "I was blind, and I failed you both," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Sarah could see the pain in his eyes, but it didn't take away the hurt she felt. Her father, the man who had been her rock, had failed her in the most fundamental way. His guilt was as visible as his remorse, but it did little to heal the wound in Sarah's heart. The room was silent for a long moment as each person processed the words that had been spoken. The damage had been done, and the emotional fallout was impossible to ignore. Sarah felt as though the world around her had collapsed. The life she had known, one built on trust and family, was now shattered. She didn't know if she could move forward with Lucas, especially when the lies had reached such monumental proportions. Could she forgive Jack for the years of deception? Could she ever trust him again? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers remained elusive. The love she once had for him, the image of the man who had raised her, now seemed distant and unreal. For Jack, the pain was just as acute. He had always seen himself as a provider, a protector, and a man of integrity, but now he was faced with the undeniable truth of his failure. He had kept secrets from his daughter, secrets that were too big to ignore, and he had hurt her in ways he never imagined. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and as he looked at Sarah, he saw the pain in her eyes that he had caused. The man who had always been so sure of himself now felt small, lost in the aftermath of his own choices. He had been living with this secret for so long, and now that it was out, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. The room was thick with the weight of the moment. The tension that had been building since Margaret's revelation had reached a boiling point. Every word, every gesture seemed to carry the weight of years of deception and hurt. The family was at a crossroads. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationships had been shattered, and now they had to decide whether to rebuild or walk away. Could they move past the lies, the betrayal and the pain, or was the damage too deep to repair? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and uncertain, as each person grappled with their own version of the truth. The weight of everything that had been revealed was too much for Sarah to bear in the confines of the ranch house. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields, she stepped outside, needing to escape the suffocating tension inside. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her love for her father, her anger at the lies he had told, and the growing distance between her and Lucas. The ranch, once a place of comfort and memories, now felt like a foreign land. She walked aimlessly, the crunch of the gravel underfoot the only sound in the stillness. Her heart ached with every step as she tried to process the truth that had turned her world upside down. Lucas, sensing her need for space but unwilling to let her be alone, quietly followed her. He kept a distance at first, not wanting to intrude, but when Sarah stopped by the old oak tree near the edge of the property, he couldn't stay away any longer. He approached cautiously, his footsteps soft against the earth. "Sarah," he said gently, his voice breaking through the silence. She didn't respond immediately, her back still turned to him, but after a moment she finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who I am anymore, Lucas." Her words were heavy, filled with confusion and despair. She turned to face him, her eyes searching for something, anything to hold on to. Lucas stepped closer, his gaze softening as he saw the pain in Sarah's eyes. "I love you," he said earnestly, taking her hand in his. "I always have, and I always will. But I can't change what's been done. I can only try to make things right from here on out." His words were sincere, but Sarah could see the guilt and uncertainty in his eyes. She felt a flicker of the love she had once had for him, but it was clouded by the painful reality of the secrets they had both kept. "But you were a part of this too," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her voice cracked as she tried to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one standing before her. Lucas's face twisted with regret. "I never meant for it to be like this," he said quietly, his grip tightening on her hand. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I was in the dark too, Sarah. I didn't know everything. I didn't know how deep the lies went." His words, though heartfelt, seemed distant to Sarah. She wanted to believe him, but the trust they had once shared felt broken beyond repair. "I know," she replied softly, her voice barely audible, "but now I can't even trust the foundation we built our relationship on. How can I go forward with someone who was part of a lie so big?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as both of them struggled with the painful truth that their relationship, like everything else, had been built on shaky ground. Back at the ranch house, Jack and Margaret were left to confront the fallout of the evening's revelations. The air was thick with tension as they sat together in silence, neither knowing how to begin. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice hesitant. "Jack, can you ever forgive me?" Her words were fragile, laced with a sense of vulnerability that she hadn't shown before. Jack turned to face her, his expression a mixture of sorrow and regret. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I wish I could say yes, but the truth is, I don't know if I can forgive myself for all of this, for all the years I missed, for not being there when I should have been. I wasn't the man I thought I was." Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached out to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. I didn't want to destroy your life, or Sarah's. I thought I was protecting you both by keeping this secret." She paused, the weight of her confession sinking in. "But now, it's all come out, and there's no going back." Jack looked at her, his gaze distant. "I regret the affair. I regret the pain it caused. But I'm also grateful," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Grateful for the son I never knew I had. I've been blind for too long, and now I have a chance to be a father again." The admission came with a mix of shame and relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his chest. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself standing at a crossroads, the weight of the decisions before her threatening to crush her. The clarity she had hoped for during her walk was still elusive. She loved Lucas, but the betrayal was too great. Her father's past, once a source of admiration and respect, now felt like a chain around her heart. She had always believed that family was everything, but now she wasn't sure what was left of the family she had once known. She could feel the tension between her and Lucas, the distance that had grown between them in such a short time. "How can I move forward?" she whispered to herself, feeling the enormity of the decision bearing down on her. After much soul-searching, Sarah knew that she couldn't go through with the wedding. "It's just too much," she said aloud, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself or to the empty air around her. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the broken trust, had become unbearable. She couldn't marry Lucas, not when everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. The pain was too raw, and the foundation they had built together was too fractured to repair. I can't forgive all of this. Not yet. Not now. Her heart ached as she made the difficult decision to call off the wedding. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but in the end, it felt like the only choice she had left. With tears in her eyes, Sarah walked back to the house, the decision weighing heavily on her chest. She knew she had made the right choice, but that didn't make it any easier. The man she had loved, the father she had trusted, and the future she had imagined were all gone now. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small sense of clarity. The past was broken, and the future uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she could begin to heal. The wedding, once filled with laughter and joy, had now come to an abrupt and painful end. The reception was a haunting silence, the air thick with unspoken words and fractured relationships. Guests, once eager to celebrate, trickled out one by one, their faces a mixture of shock, sympathy, and discomfort. The music, which had once played cheerfully, was now muted, the vibrant atmosphere replaced by a palpable sadness. Sarah, walking away from the ceremony, felt as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. The life she had once imagined was slipping through her fingers, and the reality of what had just transpired felt too overwhelming to process. She had lost her sense of direction, and everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and family had been turned upside down. Jack stood at the edge of the reception hall, his eyes searching the room, though there was no one left to look at. His daughter, the one person he had always been able to protect and guide, was slipping away from him. The betrayal of his own actions, the secrets he had kept, seemed too great to undo. He watched her leave, his heart breaking as he realized the gravity of what he had done. The man who had always been in control, who had always stood firm in his decisions, was now broken. Sarah's trust in him, something he had taken for granted, was now gone, and the chances of ever rebuilding that trust felt more distant with each passing moment. Jack's regret washed over him like a tidal wave, the weight of his mistakes suffocating him. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the ranch house, her thoughts a blur. She hadn't known what to expect when the truth came out, but this wasn't it. The man she thought she was going to marry, the man she had built a life with, now seemed like a stranger. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, the realization that their love had been built on lies. As she sat there, her mind replayed every moment of the past few days, the excitement, the anticipation, the wedding plans that now felt like a cruel joke. Her heart ached as she realized she couldn't marry Lucas. Not now, not in the wake of all the deception. Her love for him was real, but it wasn't enough to erase the doubts and the betrayal that had been uncovered. With a deep breath, Sarah stood up and made her way toward Lucas, who was standing near the door, his face etched with pain. He looked up as she approached, his eyes searching hers for some sign that things might still be okay. "I can't do this," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. "I can't marry you. Not now. I need time. I need to find myself again, away from all the lies and confusion." Her words felt like a final blow to Lucas, who stood frozen, unable to find the words to respond. His heart ached as he watched the woman he loved walk away, the weight of everything that had been revealed pressing down on him. He wanted to fix things, to make everything right again, but the damage felt insurmountable. Sarah felt her heart breaking as she walked away from Lucas, knowing that the love they once shared had been tainted beyond repair. As she moved through the house, she found herself facing the one person she never thought she'd confront like this: her father. Jack was sitting alone, his face a picture of deep sorrow. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but the words came rushing out. "How could you keep this from me?" Her voice shook as the pain and confusion in her heart spilled over. She couldn't understand how he, the man who had raised her, could have hidden something so monumental from her. Her heart ached as she stood before him, the love she had once felt for him now clouded by the anger and betrayal that filled her chest. Jack's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at his daughter, the weight of her question crushing him. He had no excuses, no way to make what he had done right. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse with regret. "I was trying to protect you. I was trying to protect all of us. But I see now that I've only hurt you." His words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of years of mistakes. Jack stood up slowly, his body shaking with the weight of his guilt. In a moment of deep regret, he fell to his knees in front of Sarah, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." The man, who had once been so strong and unshakable, was now on the floor before her, broken by the realization that his actions had cost him everything. Sarah watched her father fall to his knees, her heart torn between the love she had for him and the pain she was feeling. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she couldn't. Not yet. The trust that had been shattered was too much to overcome in one moment. She had spent her whole life believing in the man who had raised her, but now that belief felt like a distant memory. "I can't fix this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how." Tears filled her eyes as she turned away from Jack, her heart breaking with the weight of the decisions she had just made. She couldn't move forward, not until she could understand who she was without the lies that had been told to her. The final moments of the evening felt like a funeral, the air thick with sorrow and unanswered questions. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration of love had ended in tears, leaving behind only the wreckage of broken dreams. Sarah, standing at the center of it all, felt as though she was losing everything. The man she had once trusted, the man she had once loved, was now a stranger. And the family she had once known, one built on trust and love, was now a fractured shell of what it had been. Jack's world had crumbled, but it was Sarah's heart that had taken the deepest blow. As the night wore on, the silence in the house was deafening, the weight of the fall too great for any of them to bear. Months had passed since the wedding disaster, but the emotional scars still lingered. Sarah had tried to move forward with her life, but the shadow of the past seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her relationship with her father remained strained, and though there had been small attempts at reconciliation, the distance between them was palpable. She no longer felt the same connection to him, the man she had once revered. The betrayal had cut too deeply, and forgiveness, it seemed, was a long way off. But as she worked to rebuild her own life, Sarah found that the pain, though still there, was no longer controlling her. She was learning to move past it, step by step. Her relationship with Lucas, once filled with hope, had become a source of uncertainty. Though they had tried to talk and heal the rift between them, the cracks in their relationship remained. The foundation they had built together felt fragile, like a house built on sand. Sarah wasn't sure if the love they once shared was enough to mend what had been broken. The lies, the secrets, the betrayal, it all still lingered in the air between them. She loved him, but the weight of the past seemed too heavy to carry. She wasn't ready to let him back into her life completely, not when she was still trying to understand who she was without the man she had thought she knew. Meanwhile, Jack had begun the slow, difficult process of rebuilding his relationships, starting with his son, Max. After months of reflection, Jack realized that the mistakes he had made with Sarah weren't the only ones he needed to atone for. He had spent too much time buried in his own guilt and regret, neglecting the relationships that truly mattered. Though the road to redemption with Max was still long, he had made strides. He'd been there for his son in ways he hadn't been before, trying to be a better father, trying to make up for lost time. But the chasm between him and Sarah remained. She wasn't ready to forgive him, and Jack knew it. Sarah's growth in the aftermath of the wedding was not something that happened overnight. It took time, strength, and a lot of internal work. She began to realize that the pain she had endured had forced her to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. The woman she was becoming was different from the one who had walked down that aisle months ago. She was stronger, more self-aware, and more in tune with her own needs and desires. The heartbreak had shaken her, but it had also made her realize that she could survive it. She could trust herself again, and that was something no one else could take away from her. The pain of betrayal, though still present, no longer defined Sarah. She had learned to embrace the lessons it had taught her, and in doing so, had started to shed the weight of her past. Her father's mistakes, Lucas's secrets, the broken trust, it was all part of her story, but it wasn't the whole story. She was beginning to carve out a new path for herself, one where she could define her future on her own terms. No longer was she just the daughter of Jack Dawson or the fiancée of Lucas Hawthorne. She was Sarah Dawson, a woman who had faced immense pain and come out stronger on the other side. Jack, too, was learning. The months after the wedding had not been easy for him, but they had been necessary. His attempts to reconnect with Sarah had been met with coldness, but he hadn't given up. He knew that redemption wouldn't come quickly, but he also knew that he needed to change if he was ever going to have a chance at rebuilding his family. His journey was not just about asking for forgiveness, it was about proving through his actions that he was worthy of it. And as he worked on being a better father to Max, he hoped that one day Sarah might see the changes in him too. In the quiet moments, Sarah allowed herself to reflect on the road ahead. The uncertainty of her future still loomed large, but she was no longer afraid. She was learning to live with the unknown, to trust in her own strength to face whatever came next. The damage from the wedding had been deep, but it had also catalyzed a transformation in her. She wasn't the same person who had stood at the altar, believing in a fairy tale. Now, she knew that real life was messier, more complicated, and more beautiful because of the lessons it taught her. The story closed with Sarah walking toward an uncertain future, but there was a quiet determination in her step. The pain of the past would always be with her, but she had learned to carry it without letting it define her. As she walked toward the horizon, the weight of the past growing lighter with every step, she knew that healing had begun. The journey was far from over, but Sarah had found something important: herself. The pieces of her life had been shattered, but she was learning how to rebuild them, stronger and more resilient than ever before.